right, well, it's only exactly 2:15, but we may as well get underway since we have such a cast up here. As you know, this is the session Using LIDO in the Real World, Emerging Practice in Museum Metadata Sharing. The overall curve of things will be, first we'll be hearing from Erin Coburn about LIDO in general. Then we'll hear from Emmanuelle Delmas-Glass from the Yale Center for British Art, and from me, who I have not said who I am, Rob Lancefield from the Davison Art Center at Wesleyan University. Emmanuelle and I will talk in sequence about how we're currently using LIDO on the supply side, and then we'll talk briefly about a little harmonization project that we're starting to work on. After that, we'll hear from Bill Ying from Artstor and Piotr Adamczyk from Google about what this looks like from the aggregators side. And after that, we hope to have some good time for questions. With that, Erin Coburn.
So how many people know what LIDO is? Oh, that's great. How many people actually use it? Oh, really? Is that why you're all here? Okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. So I'm an independent consultant, but I previously worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Getty Museum, and I have a long history working with museum documentation standards and was part of a committee, international committee that created LIDO. So it's my pleasure to give you a very brief and high-level introduction to LIDO. So most of you probably know, if you're here and you raise your hands, that you're familiar with LIDO, that this is an XML schema for delivering metadata on objects in your collections to a variety of online services in a standardized way. And one of the primary reasons for LIDO is because there are a variety of different union resources or portals out there. These are sites that want to aggregate museum content, and there's an increasing amount of them that have been added over the years. And yet it has been quite difficult for museums to participate in a lot of these initiatives. And one of the primary reasons for LIDO was to allow a mechanism by which a museum could mark up a data set according to a common format that is then recognizable by these different union resources who could then come and harvest it. And so it's the idea behind it is to simplify how we contribute to different union resources so that we're not having to reinvent the wheel each time we want to add something to a different union resource. So LIDO is actually not new. It was launched in 2010, but its history goes back quite further. It actually sort of started around 2004 when the J. Paul Getty Museum and the Getty Research Institute and the Getty Trust and Artstor got together and said, we really should come up with a way to make it easier for museums to contribute to union resources. And what we came up with is a harvesting format, an XML schema called CDWA Lite. CDWA Lite is built on categories for the description of works of art, which is a data structure standard, and cataloging cultural objects, which is a data content standard. So that was released in 2006, and it was well received by the museum community. And then our colleagues over in Germany looked at it and they said, this is great, however, it's very fine art specific, and it doesn't do a good job of handling diverse museum collections, and it doesn't do a good job of handling complex data. So our German colleagues created a second schema called MuseumDat, which was built on CDWA Lite. And we looked at it and we said, well, that's fantastic, but we really shouldn't have two schemas that are out there. So we joined forces and decided to create one common schema for the international community, and along the way realized that we needed to make sure we recognized other international standards. So we brought in Spectrum, which is a collection management standard in the United Kingdom, and then the CDOC conceptual reference model. All of this resulted in LIDO, which was launched in 2010 at the ICOM CDOC conference in Shanghai. So I share all that with you by way of saying that if you're familiar with CDWA Lite, LIDO has replaced it. And the other reason I share all that with you is to drive home how much LIDO really takes into account very critical standards for our community. So I'm going to do just highlights of the of LIDO, really to help show the scope of it without going into the actual schema, because the schema is big and very detailed, and I might lose some of you. But also because our panelists will probably show parts of the schema, so I'll leave that to them. So LIDO is, again, this XML schema for delivering metadata to a variety of online services. And more often than not, it is used for contributing to portals of aggregated resources. But there are examples of people who use LIDO to serve up information to their online collection database. So LIDO really is about exposing, sharing, and connecting data on the web. LIDO is intended to represent the full range of descriptive information about museum objects. And again, it now can accommodate whether your collection is a fine arts collection or a cultural collection or technology or natural sciences. And this is really the descriptive information about an object. This is not a cataloging standard. It's not where you would put information about the business activities around your objects or that you have in your collection management system. This is the descriptive metadata that you would share with something online. So great to see all of you join us. No problem. All right, so LIDO also supports multilingual environments, and there are a couple of different ways in the schema in which you can accommodate different languages at different levels. So if you had different labels, for example, in different languages, the schema can accommodate that. Or if you want to have different records that are in certain languages, it can accommodate that. LIDO also is quite flexible in terms of how light or how rich your metadata records are. So it is intentionally meant to be low barrier. If you have very minimal cataloging records, that's fine. You can still contribute them to Union resources. And if you have really, really rich, complex metadata records, the schema can accommodate that. LIDO also allows for delivering data both about your objects and about the resources or digital surrogates that go with it. And this is pretty important and especially helpful for aggregators to be able to know the distinction between metadata that is describing your object and metadata that is describing an image or a video that you are sending also with that record about the object. So you can clearly separate those two. LIDO also allows for including a link that can send someone somewhere else. More often than not, this is to see an object back on a museum's website. And the reason for doing this is that when Union resources started to come about, and this was really back in the CDWA light time, the idea was that we didn't want anyone to think that they had to take all of the rich content and interpretive material that they had on their websites and hand it over to Artstor. That you really should be able to contribute whatever information is relevant about your object that is necessary for Artstor and makes sense in Artstor, but then have the ability to point someone back to that object on your own website where they can see lots of other rich interpretive material that you have and learn about the object in the context of the other objects in your collection. LIDO also allows for having an identification for a referenced entity, or another way of putting this is you can have an ID associated with a term. So if you use, for example, a Getty vocabulary like the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, and you use a term from there, you can also include the ID for that term and a source that says that it comes from the AAT. This is really, really helpful for aggregators because then if they have the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, they can link that term up with the AAT and then they can use it to provide much richer retrieval and access to the objects in their resource. And then LIDO finally allows for a way to be able to separate display elements from indexing elements. And this is something that actually comes out of cataloging cultural objects. So this is very helpful for both the aggregators and for museums to be able to stipulate how you want metadata to be presented. So for example, if you have a date range of beginning date 1575 and an end date of 1599, you may want that to be displayed as late 16th century. So the schema allows you to be able to have how should this stuff be displayed and then how can you field it so that it allows for good search and retrieval. So I'll just finish with this slide, which has this is the main sort of summary of information groups, both descriptive and administrative, that comprise of LIDO, the schema. So you have object classification elements. This is your object work type. There's a classification element. Then you have object identification elements. So you have title or name, inscriptions, repository location, state edition, object description, and measurements. Then you have what's called an event set. An event set is where you would put information that relates to events about the object. This is a slightly different way of thinking if you're not familiar with events, and it comes out of the CDOT conceptual reference model. But this is where you put information about the creation or the production of an object. So artist information, place information, geographical information, date information, materials, techniques. And by having this broken out into separate events, it allows the ability to include much richer information about that particular event and then to associate it with an object so that aggregators have a lot more meaning behind the data that we have about our objects. So it's just a different way to structure it, but it can allow for really rich and detailed meaning about certain activities or events associated with the object. Then there's also a subject set, related works, and then the administrative metadata is rights, an element about the actual record that you're contributing, and then where you have your resources. So that's essentially how the schema is broken down. And then I will turn it over to our colleagues here on the panel who will talk to you about the various ways that they're implementing LIDO.
Great, thank you, Erin. Since we are beginning with a sequence of fairly quick, fast presentations, I'll ask that we hold all questions for the end when we should have a nice chunk of time for some Q&A involving everyone.
Okay, are you next?
Next will be Emmanuelle Delmas-Glass from the Yale Center for British Art.
You might want to go presentation mode.
Right, so I will be giving you a brief overview of how we use LIDO at the Yale Center for British Art. Just quickly, a brief profile about the Yale Center for British Art. It's a medium-sized museum with a very highly specialized collection, and most of our partners really for organizing exhibitions and publications are overseas. And so I think we're naturally poised basically to collaborate with partners outside of the US, of course, but multiple partners in general. So how do we use LIDO at the YCBA? Well, we have a somewhat ambitious agenda here, and we are using LIDO for those four purposes. So LIDO needs to support our in-depth cataloging. It is our data exchange standard. It's also our cross-collection discovery tool, as well as it's also the way it also supports linked open data. This is the architecture behind how we use LIDO, and I'll just preface this with saying that we don't have to use LIDO, but we do because it really expresses our data quite well. It's a granular schema. It also comes with free tools, and some of them have been created by the OCRC Research Museum Data Exchange project a few years back. And so two of those tools are Coburn and the OAI Cat Museum. So the Yale Center for British Art has a little bit of experience with data exchange protocols. We've been using CDWA Lite. We used it about 5 years ago, and when LIDO superseded CDWA Lite, we switched over. And so we've been using LIDO for about, I'd say, three years now. So why LIDO? What's different about LIDO? So Erin covered a little bit of this, of course, talking about events. And the elements highlighted for tombstone cataloging here is what CDWLI allowed us to express. LIDO does this and more. It also supports our in-depth cataloging, such as curatorial commons or publication or exhibition events. This is, by the way, a screenshot of our online collections catalog. So in red, we're looking at the LIDO event types that the museum uses currently. There are many more. One thing I wanted to highlight is the role of unique identifiers in your data and the way LIDO uses them. So here, the first rectangle, 757, is the unique identifier of this exhibition called Connections in our collections management system. I've also highlighted the Yale Celebrity Shot because as an event, it's a complex event, basically, right? It's not only talking about exhibition, but also the constituent or actors that relate to that event. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about what LIDO can do. Another example is how LIDO can express bibliographic citations. I will draw your attention here to the fact that it's not an event per LIDO. It's a related work. It's one of the nuances of the schema that are important to keep in mind. Again, LIDO will reuse the unique identifier for that citation in our system, as well as the unique identifier for the citation proper. And in this case, we're using OCLCs. This is the OCLC record for that same bibliographic citation, The Pursuit of Happiness. OCLC, of course, very nicely also gives you the place where to find the book or that copy. So eventually, we would love to actually embed the URIs for those citations from OCLC into our data set. And you will notice that the URI for this particular record, 3447120, is embedded in the URI. So there's a nice continuity between unique identifiers and actionable links. This is just an overview of the LIDO related work element or dataset for bibliographic citation. So I'm spending a little bit of time talking about the concept sources and concept IDs because they're really critical for the data to do something a little bit more interesting with them. So we indicate the source of the terms we're using. In this case, it's AAT, and we're referencing their unique identifiers, and we're also saying what role they play in our data. So in this case, the LIDO type points to object name. And you will notice that painting, the term in our data set, is used for two things. It's used as an object name as well as a classification. But the numbers, of course, the unique identifiers will be similar. It's the same concept, really, in the AT. So I should talk a little bit about our philosophy in terms of data exchange protocols at the center, because we want to contribute to as many data aggregators as we can. We use the COPE approach, so create once and publish everywhere. So this is, you all know this interface, of course. This is the Google Cultural Institute interface. and a couple of years ago, I think we were the museum that contributed the most records, about 5,200. And I want to think that the fact that we use the data, a standard data exchange protocol, just such as LIDO, contributed to our easiness for this project. We're now looking at the Yale-wide cross-collection discovery system, which the center also contributes to. So many other units on campus contribute to this portal. The interesting thing here is that LIDO is the schema of reference for crosswalking all the different metadata standards that we're using on campus. And you'll see that there's a natural history museum, which of course uses Darwin Core, and a variety of other metadata standards here. But again, LIDO is the crosswalk schema. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth. That's really the point of this talk. But here I just wanted to contrast on the left one of our records in the Yale-wide cross-collection discovery service and how we express the same record on our local online catalog. And you'll notice that on the left in the crosswalk, they have left out the secondary contributor or artist for this record. So it's just a print by David Lucas. So there's a simplification of the data that has happened a little bit. Of course, in our online catalog, we say that this print was made by Lucas after John Constable, and probably most people will know Constable rather than Lucas. LIDO is also used as a cross-collection discovery tool for us internally. The center has not only an art collection, but also a reference library, as well as a rare books and manuscript collection. And those two are cataloged in a different system. On the left is the library, Orbis is the library system. And on the right is TMS, which is the collections management system we're using to catalog the art collections. But eventually, they can be searched seamlessly here in this one search box on our website. This is actually the only place that offers a one single search box. Yale library system has a different entity or search interface altogether. Another point that is of extreme importance to us is that LIDO is CDOC CRM compliant, and as you may know by now, the center is very interested in linked open data, and so it has allowed us to really look at our data very granularly and assign all those unique identifiers and really take a good look at what we're doing with our data. For us, it's a very good stepping stone, really. So we're going to talk a little bit about challenges, and one of them is, of course, that museums are using LIDO differently. So for aggregators, that's a little bit of a challenge. Another potential problem, of course, is that different aggregators may expect different LIDO flavors. And my third point here about aggregators not being interested in rich metadata really talks to the point that at some point I think there might be a little bit of a philosophical divergence where museums want to produce the richest data set that they can, and data aggregators might not be interested in using all of that richness. So what are the opportunities here for us, the museum community? Well, I think LIDO is a fantastic tool to go back to the drawing board a little bit and really make sure that we are producing shareable metadata. And it starts with very small and easy steps. The other thing that we can do to make this communication with aggregators a little bit easier is to create metadata profiles. So this is what Rob will be talking about in a minute. And I've put two other things here that museum really should be thinking about more than just discovery, and really think about the next step. What do we do after the fact that we have created such rich and granular data? And a couple of references in terms of shareable metadata, and actually the architecture of the center is here on the first link. Thank you.
Okay, so as a second case example of one museum operation using LIDO for metadata sharing, I'll talk a bit about the Davison Art Center at Wesleyan University, which is in Connecticut. We are the university's small, very small art museum operation with a collection of about 24,000 objects. These are mostly works of art on paper, and they're used intensively by students and faculty for teaching and learning from objects. And our total museum staff consists of 2.5 positions, 2 full-time people and a full-time guy who does installing and preparation, but we share him with another gallery on campus. So with such a tiny staff, totally different kinds of work always contend for zero-sum time. That can make it challenging to get new things, such as this, moving. And if the way we try to serve a new aim isn't as efficient as possible, the time it takes often has way too much impact on existing work in quite completely different areas, or delays the new work and delays it and delays it. We knew we'd have to minimize the time needed to prepare the structural aspects of metadata sharing, probably by focusing on constructing just one template. We knew that we wanted to be able to contribute to multiple aggregators via one format, not tailored one-offs, and ideally in a way that could also support public-facing download of one-off records. And we also knew we needed to be able to make new data sets quickly as we tuned their structure and content in the initial phases of working towards valid, usable output. The best candidate for this was LIDO, no surprise, we're here in this session. It could handle the data elements we wanted to share. The aggregators we're working with could accept it. And our collection system had the prospective capability to export it, so we knew we could find a way to automate its creation. The best way for us to do that would have to leverage resources we already had in place, making it easy to keep tuning our data structure and field mapping. And as I had mentioned, we also really hope to support public download as well for all those individual users out there who are just dying to pull down a LIDO record, but there may be a few. As it turned out, our existing infrastructure for DAC collection search helped us to do this quickly. So here's the requisite diagram, which it is readable up there, not bad. So 3 main things are going on here. At the left side is our back-of-house system, which is Embark Collection Manager, where we actually don't make LIDO. There would be ways of doing so, for example, by using software called Coburn, which Emmanuelle mentioned. But those approaches would have been somewhat more time-intensive to set up and less useful for our needs in some ways than a really lightweight approach. So all we do back-of-house in this regard is just populate a few fields that supply specific content for LIDO, such as item type, or hold flags that we use downstream to control the later inclusion or exclusion of certain LIDO elements in each record. Whoops, let's go back. Okay. In the middle, we periodically copy our collection data file for web access onto a public-facing server. Before putting it there, by the way, we do redact everything in certain fields. And while that's for general risk mitigation, not specific to LIDO, it does provide a kind of safety net by usefully limiting what a rogue LIDO request could expose if it were misconfigured to pull from a confidential field, and if somehow permission settings were wrong for that. It's just a belt and suspenders thing. there'd just be no content there. And on the right is our public-facing collection search, where LIDO actually happens. When a URL requesting LIDO hits DAC collection search, the Embark web kiosk instance on which that runs uses a template to generate LIDO on the fly, pulling metadata from that redacted data file and returning a LIDO record to the user. So that LIDO template is just an XML file that sits on that server where Embark web kiosk runs on the 4D database engine, as many people here will know. In making that template, we triangulated between the LIDO spec itself and a Gallery Systems default template that did some of what we needed as a starting point, and specific knowledge of how the DAC itself populates that backend data structure, which, as we know, typically differs place to place despite our shared love of standards, which fields we use and for what. The template uses 4D tags to tell Embark web kiosk what content to pull in from the data file. If you're used to developing human-readable web pages backed by web kiosk, this is really, really similar. It's just targeted for a machine-readable XML file instead. And broadly speaking, this kind of lightweight approach could well be possible with web resources backed by other systems. This isn't Embark specific, it's just the way it's articulated here. Those 4D tags include some conditionals that we use to include, to control the inclusion of certain LIDO elements in each record. For example, here, that no known copyright restrictions text. And moving to the front end of what this all looks like for users, for metadata sharing with individuals, people using this resource can just follow a link on each object page to get LIDO for that record, and to zoom in and down a little bit, down there at the lower left. It's way down there in the fine print, by the way, because we figure the vast majority of our users will have no interest in this, and seeing something to click on and clicking on it out of curiosity and getting some raw XML is not really going to make their day. So we figure those who want it will be able to find it. So clicking on a link like that generates LIDO on the fly, and a quick look at how that works will also illustrate how each LIDO record is made within a larger batch file that we would run behind the scenes for an aggregator, which would just grab some number of those records and lump them into one LIDO wrap element. So here's that conditional element for works with no known copyright restrictions, here written out into an actual rendered record. And I should say, just in general here, LIDO has a whole lot of optional elements. And since we knew we were going to be running big batches here, we do run a fair number of conditionals to test for content in each record in certain fields, because the 90% of records that may not have anything there, that way we're not running out a ton of empty elements to make the file heavier than it has to be. Another conditional controls a block of resource elements for works for which we have DAC open access images. And you may recall in Erin's slides, there was that resource group in the top level look at what sets of elements exist in LIDO. This is not a typical sense of what that sort of content tends to look like. So there's a fully qualified URL out where the resource lives and a little bit of information about it. Because the template is just XML, revising it is really straightforward if you are happy working with XML. So here's the one part of the template, and toggling here now, here's that same part of the template after rendering. You'll see effectively all of the LIDO markup hierarchy that this is living in is just sitting there the same. There are just these calls back to the database to pull certain stuff in. So by example, toggling again here, this is Embark being told to look and see if there's content in artist code, which we know in our world means there's a ULN ID. And if there is, then it'll pull that and render that LIDO element out and stick the ULN ID into it. So that is how people can download LIDO records one by one. To make single file batch records of metadata for image groups we supply to aggregators, we use the same template, so we only have that one thing to tune for our own efficiency and ease. We use private crafted URLs in the same way to make LIDO files for sets of records. And I should say those URLs are private not for any policy reason, but because of big batch process, doing this can really slow down that server on which our public collection search runs, and we'd rather not have people waiting around while I'm generating some big batch of something. Which is to say, I also often do this on our dev server, but it's functionally identical to the public-facing one. Sharing our metadata in this way, which I could call we hope one size fits all approach, makes for some needed efficiency under our roof. But that said, we might wonder whether not in some way tailoring metadata for each aggregator could risk making their own work harder, which leads from the material I've just presented, which is really just about what we're doing at the Davison Art Center, to a couple of minutes on something Emmanuelle and I have started working on. So, conference theme, had to work it in somehow. In the broadest terms, we should be able to reduce the need for one-off parsing of LIDO from different museums by using it as consistently as possible everywhere. No-brainer, right? As one aggregator, who I shall not name, has been heard to lament, everybody's LIDO is different. Not sure who that would have been, but he may be talking to us in a few minutes. But we can try to make that less true on the supply side by making our LIDO more alike. Second part of conference theme, start small. As a small local step in that direction, Emmanuelle and I have started working to harmonize how we populate LIDO specifically for printed works of art. And we're hoping to settle on and document as much shared practice as we can manage to do that still fits both of our local institutional contexts. In each of our settings, third piece of conference theme, some aspects of cataloging mean we have certain content to supply or not in systematic ways, or partially similar content that still needs to land in different elements. So after figuring out where our own local use of LIDO differs, harmonizing it as much as we can, we'll then document any differences we need to hold on to in order to mesh with our local contexts of data management, cataloging. That may in turn lead to what we're sort of calling a discordance, documentation of where our LIDO differs systematically, with the hope that this could make it easier for an aggregator to either build and tune a parser for both of our collections and whoever else might decide they want to use the same thing for prints, or to take a parser that already works with one and be able to tweak it in an efficient way to work with output from the other without having to scroll through hundreds and thousands of records and discover on record 1,312 that, oh, look, these folks are populating that element, but we didn't see it till now because it's sparse. This might also lead to a proposed LIDO profile for prints, but that remains an open question at this point. We've started very small with just 10 pairs of records for our different impressions of the same prints in both collections, and we're finding some things we can fine-tune. For example, and this is really small, but it's the kind of drill down detail that can either be a pain in the neck or help things run smoothly. We both use a field for inscriptions, and we both combine description and transcription into one string in that field for practical reasons of what we need to do with that at home. I would guess that many of us in the room, on the one hand, would understand the logical wonderment of breaking out such things as it's an inscription in this color ink, and a separate set of fields for it's in the lower right corner, and a separate set for it's on the verso, and a separate dedicated field for the stuff that is literal transcription of that. But in practice, breaking it out that way during cataloging and reassembling it for reporting use and labels and such, I would guess that not many people here actually would do that. It's a string. LIDO, wonderfully, has two more finely sliced elements into which that inscription content might reasonably go. Inscription description, which you'll see at the top, and inscription transcription, which you'll see at the bottom. And you can really make a reasonable case for or against either of those approaches. I won't go through that because we could all summon it up. But we're looking basically at just different levels of granularity and not a perfect one-to-one fit, but we do want to transport it, so where does it go? as you can see in these snippets, one of us decided to use inscription description, one of us decided to use inscription transcription, but we're just going to be talking some more and deciding which one we're going to use. Each of us had previously assessed the pros and cons of each approach and settled on different ones, but by ironing out this kind of thing and just making it more consistent, we are hoping that that incrementally results in more consistent practice across our two collections. And there are other similar points like this as well. And that in combination with really good, really clear documentation, both of what elements we are using for what sorts of content, and with those places where we diverge for local sort of tactical reasons, could then make it easier on the aggregation side, because it won't be quite so mysterious to get LIDO from one of our shops if you've already got it from the other. With that, Emmanuelle, do you have anything to add about the project, the work that we're doing for now? Or okay, great. We will move right along to Bill Ying. So now we are shifting over to the aggregation side.
Full screen.
The bottom lower. Bottom.
Oh, right here. Yes.
Bottom.
Hi, I'm Bill Ying. I'm from Artstor. And as Rob mentioned, we represent the aggregator side. So I just want to give you a quick introduction of Artstor. Most of you know us. We launched it 10 years ago, and we have more than 1.8 million images with 200 collections and used by more than 1,600 universities and colleges. Our subscriber users for all kinds of teaching and learning, from history, literature, to political science. Today, we have contribution from 140 museums, 153 special contributors, altogether 278 collections, almost 1.8 million images. And we have beautiful images from museums for decorative art, and even for history of science and medicine. We also help our museum contributor make some of the images available for scholarly publishing. And we also help contribute some of the content to digital public library. And so now, I'm sure most of you heard of this phrase from Kermit's, not easy being green, right? So now, if Miss Peggy worked for Artstor, what do you think she's going to say? Well, she's not skinny, I squish her a little bit. It's not easy to be a content aggregator. So why? Okay, so a couple years ago, we did a survey to a lot of the cultural institutions. How do they catalog the digital collection? And this is what I call the rainbow chart. Actually, more color than rainbow. Rainbow is only 7. And it shows you how diversified people use different tools to catalog cultural collections. And so museum is similar. Ooh, why did I put this chart here? It looks like the apple pie I ate last night. I eat the big chunk. You can see the blue part is my wife. But actually, it's not true. It's the percentage of contributors using LIDO right now to Artstor. I'm sorry, this chart is misleading. It includes all the contributors from 10 years ago, before LIDO started. But we're seeing more. So it's a good trend. And the problem is contributor method come in all shape and size and form. And we've seen every standard under the sun, from Dublin Core, Mark, Morse, CWLI, LIDO, Excel, and what. And some people even give us a native database dump. Here's the database. Okay, you figure out how to get the data. So it's not easy. And traditionally, we figure out how to map the contributor data, either complex, simple, to simple Artstor display schema. As Emmanuelle mentioned earlier, we don't know how to handle rich metadata in the early days. But even simple metadata mapping is a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But now we decide to get richer and more sophisticated. So we have a software called ShareShell we plan to use called ShareShell for Artstor. Then we experiment to mapping complex metadata from contributor to Artstor. So what is ShareShell? ShareShell is a software that we're launching recently with more than 116 subscribers. Oops, sorry. And it is a complex cataloging system with vocabulary, the usual name, work, ATTGN. So we figured since our subscriber using it, we must well use it ourselves. So the first thing we want to do is, since we have a complex cataloging system, let's try to map a complex contributor content. So LIDO is a perfect example for us. So we get a LIDO XML, and we figure out how to map it into ShareShell. So of course, we all know we need a style sheet. So first we'll create project in ShareShell, and we configure project so we can map the LIDO content into it, and upload the LIDO XML, and use our own tool to ingest the XML and load it into our complex cataloging system. So first, we have our own schema. You can see we have a container plus the work schema, display schema, name schema, ATTN schema, and one LIDO schema. So to map LIDO into ours. And as Erin mentioned to us earlier, the minimum mandatory is the 3 fields. So those are the 3 things we need. But of course, we want more. We don't want just those 3. So we, like most of us who work with this kind of ETL, we use Mint. So Mint was very good. So we were able to use Mint to load LIDO into our ShareShell IO. But we all want more, right? So we all want to be brave and start using a XSLT editor to see if we can fine-tune it or finish the last 10–20%. And then we'll set up a project inside ShareShell. And the problem is, as I mentioned, we're still doing simple publishing into the Artstor digital library. So even though we ingest rich work data, we still map everything into a simple flat model to be published to Artstor today. So with our own tool to do that, and then we configure our system to accept the LIDO content with our own ingestion tool that can understand the style sheet. And so we load it. We use our friend's famous example, YCBA LIDO, and we run our program, use a style sheet, confirm it to ShareShell XML, load it into ShareShell. Now we have the normal display record. We also have work record. And then with work record to show all the multiple related display records. So now we can handle all the complex relationship that a contributor give to us. So the question we always ask inside Artstor is that, how many unique work of art do we have in Artstor from any given artist? Wow, it will be easy, right? If all the content provider give us LIDO and use Kona ID and ULAN ID. Well, we don't even need Kona ID. All your content are unique. Just give me ULAN ID. So getting consistent rich metadata is great, but getting consistent source authority will even be better. So that's why I'm here asking, gently. And so this presentation demonstrates how we use mapping to ingest LIDO content into ShareShell, which is a complex cataloging tool, and apply to any schema as long as we find a style sheet. I mean, just like we need style sheet programmer. And still involve testing and QA. That's why I'm so excited. Rob and Emmanuelle are trying to standardize it, so we need less programming work to look at what are the slightly differences between different museums. But we're excited because we are ready and we want rich data. So I repeated 3 times already. We want rich data and we're ready to take advantage of the rich data. So, but at the same time, having all this rich data in our cataloging system is only half the story. We still have to enhance our discovery site so we can take advantage of all this rich data. But that's what we're doing now. And also having a standard LIDO allowed to reharvest the data so it can update or add new content, not a one-shot deal. So our dream is to reverse the chart, right? So with the little slice is those that don't use LIDO. That's the plan. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And next up is Piotr Adamczyk from Google.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm from that small startup in Mountain View. We work on the Cultural Institute and the Art Project. I'll start with an addendum first. Yesterday, some of my colleagues might have suggested that my comments about LIDO did not express my clear-voiced and full-throated support of the standard. I am here to say that if you care about the environment, if you care about world peace, you need to be using LIDO. If you do it for the children, just every time you can, LIDO is the way to do. everything in a museum and ever. Just always use LIDO. That said, a lot of our experiences really do reflect what Bill had to say. Most of the institutions that we deal with have flat data representations, and they choose to share those flat data representations with us in a flat data file. Sometimes it's a Word document. More often than not, it's a spreadsheet. And a lot of the richness that's missing from those descriptions and missing from those metadata records is the reason why we're only able to create flat websites. And we can only give you filtering and classification and faceting of that information across hundreds of collections across the world, is because that's the only snippet of information, one or two little pieces of information that we know that we can standardize across those collections, is because it's coming in that flat format. If LIDO was more readily accepted and used in multiple contexts, I sincerely believe it would be a lot easier to get a lot of rich things built into the web services that we all use across institutions. And the more we do it in the cases, again, of these, whether it be specific collections and very kind of niche collections perhaps, and we try to solve those problems there, that ultimately it'll help all of us, whether we're huge aggregators or small museums trying to contribute to larger projects, that LIDO basically just has to be the way that we go forward. So that's the position I'm taking.
Yep, so thanks, Peter. All of you all now. Questions, comments? If and as you do, if you can please use the microphone, that will be excellent for the recording of this session.
So having worked for organizations that do a lot of data aggregation in my life, I would say you are right, it's being hard, but it's also your job. And in fact, you have a better perspective on the variety of data and how it all works than anybody else. Because those of us who sit in particular spaces, we only know our own stuff. So that's just sort of one comment. But beyond that, when I look at LIDO, I'm remembering TEI, Text Encoding Initiative, which had a huge, exceedingly rich BTD and what happened while no one used it. So then they went to TEI Lite, which was also fairly rich, and again, not very many people used it, and only a subset. So I think Rob's point about developing templates in the community is going to be really important. And I would encourage you to share what you're doing and to share with others so that we can begin to have some common practice. And I guess the last thing, this is more me just mouthing off and asking a question, is that it seems to me also that we're in a situation where something akin to what librarians did with AACR2. In other words, what are the rules for putting stuff in these buckets? Here are the buckets for the and we have those rules. As you begin to develop those things too, I think this interoperability, which we all see as sort of the holy grail of data transfer and data communication, will be easier. So I think we're at the beginning of a long road. And what I'm hearing today, I think, is very encouraging to me on all those.
Yeah, the buckets versus rules, maybe I can speak to that, because the rules are what are killing me, really. The buckets, I think we've got those figured out, and that's the LIDO spec. And it's there, and it's fairly clear in terms of what those buckets are supposed to be. But even the people on the panel didn't agree on what rules they should follow to fill those buckets. And from the, honestly, yes, perhaps that person was right, that everyone's LIDO is different. That the content coming in, the semantics were not such that, personally, I could not do anything with the information coming in from LIDO, because the values inside those buckets were so different, I couldn't do anything with it. That the location data, for example, one was a place depicted, the other one was a shelf in a storage locker, the other one was, and how am I supposed to search across that or geocode that, or,
yeah. In fact, where the community will need to begin to talk about, from a standards-based point of view, what should be in those buckets. Now, it should be using the library model of Mark and AACR2, where you've got a gazillion buckets, a gazillion rules, and so it's clearer how to do it. Even though Mark records definitely want to know.
Right,
And
and
I was
Erin
going
at
to say,
CCO.
so I'll just sort of add to that, cataloging cultural objects is a data content standard and was really meant to help people with how they actually use a metadata element. Like, how do you actually consistently put things into certain fields? When do you use a control vocabulary? All of that. So it's this comes up all the time with LIDO, is this frustration over how people, like, if your data doesn't go in consistently or you don't have good cataloging best practices, it almost renders LIDO useless for an aggregator, because the structure is helpful to know that it's consistent, but if the data is all over the place and people are putting in different fields, then it doesn't do anything. So I say that as a plug for cataloging cultural objects, because it is a data content standard to help with cataloging. But the other, and this is similar to what Rob and Emmanuelle are working on, is the more documentation that we can have around how people are using LIDO, and the more recommendations for what you actually do with those elements, the easier it will be for the community to use it, and the easier it will be for aggregators to make sense of it. So that's what we're working on right now, these types of things. And I put this up on the screen to show that LIDO is it lives under CDOC, which is the International Committee for Documentation, which is part of the International Council of Museums. So it has a home. And I actually serve as one of the co-chairs for LIDO with my colleague Regina Stein in Germany. She's with Photo Marburg. And there is lots of activity that's happening international around LIDO and exactly this issue with how do we create recommendations for how to use it. In fact, there's a German standards working group that is looking at all of the museums across Germany and their use of LIDO, and then trying to come up with recommendations and profiles for different types of collections that use LIDO and different ways that you use LIDO. So we're hoping that as that work gets up to us and gets approved, we will make it available on this website so that people can have access to it.
And since Erin mentioned the sorts of ad hoc harmonization work that we, and I no doubt other people out there are working on somewhere, I just add that it's actually not only people on the museum side, like Emmanuelle and me, but that work can be far more efficient and far more useful and far more, well, comprehensive is a dangerous word, but far less likely to miss things if we are in a fairly tight feedback loop with people in Bill's and Peter's positions, where on the one hand, a couple of us can sit down and try to harmonize what we're doing as suppliers, but often the best way to discover things that are strange or could be made more useful or less painful is to hear back from people who are seeing far larger data sets contributed in. And in that context, things that seem perfectly sensible and right in any one shop or any one couple of shops may stand out as anomalies that would be tremendously easy to tweak and fix and make easier if only we know they exist. And the best way to discover that is through seeing things in context of lots more stuff.
I think in libraries we're used to having rules handed and rule interpretations further handed to us, so as how to interpret this data and use it correctly so that we can mark it up and communicate it, and OCLC can run very complex searches that do exactly what we want. And so LIDO's great. It's lovely to see buy-in from so many different kinds of constituents. It's reminding me a little bit of EAD, which also had similar promises from the outset of being this way that archival information from disparate repositories could communicate with each other, but in fact, in practice, people used it in so many different ways that none of it's communicable with anything else. So I'm wondering if any experimentation has been done with LIDO, if there's anyone using LIDO with archival documents, and if that's helping at all, because in my world anyway, whether something's art or whether something's archival actually can be tricky, and it would be lovely to simply say, okay, well, you can express these as LIDO too, and contribute them as well to any aggregators.
I mean, from our perspective anyway, it's content. I really don't mind whether it's coming from a library, an archive, or a museum. Internally, we map it all to a standard that we have to use to publish that content to the website. And internally, we have a process that'll publish it out as a valid LIDO file. There's no one else using or ingesting those LIDO files, but we have to map the fields in a particular way that we get in from all of the contributors out to LIDO. So yeah, I mean, of course, the nuance, it's a lossy process, and some of the nuance gets dropped every time you do a translation. But at the same time, yeah, of course, there has to be, those rules, that standardization just has to be generalizable enough that regardless of where it's coming from, you still have those common fields that will allow for that cross-collection search regardless of where the content's coming from.
And just to follow up on that, if archival organizations were to be contributing to LIDO, is there any vision at what descriptive level would be relevant for LIDO? At the item level, at the series level, at the collection level?
10 level.
Yeah, we'll take. I mean,
12 level.
It's the object classification or work type problem, right? So that you could be describing anything with the LIDO record itself. You could be providing it at all of those levels, or at the scrap of paper level, depending on whichever way you want to do it. So it's possible in any case.
Ben.
I think the one I really want to know is, so Rob and Emmanuelle, you're talking to each other about this, and you're saying, description. But from the description, you're not talking to anyone else to say, well, let's get a third one, or talking to Bill and Peter to say, well, what are anyone else using? Should there be, should you guys open up?
Oh, yeah. That's an easy one up here, too. Thank you for the softball. Because we've really just started talking about this with the firm intent that as soon as we've had time just to go through and come up with some sort of initial sense of where the two of us differ most, that then the conversation becomes wider, as opposed to widening it out initially and saying, making it more inchoate and difficult for people to respond to. But, yeah. Yep.
Was the reporting stage at the end of that goes, okay, so we've gone across how many institutions it was, and these, this field is being used by these people. And this is, I guess, a question really for Bill and Peter. Have you done surveys? Can you say are more people using inscription?
Well, when we get more, I mean, so far these are the ones I'm getting. So we are all learning together.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
We're working on another one, as you know. We're working on another one, another museum. We're helping them to extract LIDO. So once the number grow up, we will be perfect. Happy to share, work together.
I reckon that was about 3%.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was 2 adding up to 1%.
1%. Exactly. 2 adding up to 1%.
Yeah, about those kinds of numbers. I mean, in terms of 5 or 6 out of the 630 live participants on the site currently are using LIDO. So the reasons for that are not so much even, it's nothing wrong with LIDO. It's not LIDO's fault. Let me say that also. From the perspective of the institutions, they wouldn't know what to do with it if we asked them for it. I mean, in terms of, we say we accept it, it's the standard format, the only XML format that we accept natively. Everything else is through flat files. It's simply that the institutions are not either don't have their data in that level of description that it would be of any value for them to necessarily encode it in LIDO, that if they did it in LIDO, that we'd be asking questions of the curators and conservators and rest of staff at the institution that never would have considered whether or not it should go in the inscription, transcription, description field. And it would take longer for them to debate that than it would for them to give us a flat file. So ultimately, I mean, that's really the problem. It's not there's nothing wrong with the standard at that level. It's much more a museum practice and a cataloging practice question.
Is it then the wrong project that you guys are working on? Because merging your two LIDO templates, maybe the answer needs to be, how do we get actually more people using LIDO? Then we can solve the problem, because then it'll be a real problem.
I mean, like I said, all of our partners, and I'm sure Bill could produce the same in terms of we could give everyone back LIDO. That you give us what you have and we'll give you LIDO records back. You can enrich them as you'd like. That's not a problem. Together, that's close to 1,000. But, what are we going to do with it? I think maybe that's a question for all of you, too. So.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also a tools issue. If you have a management system like TMS or some other system that knows how to give you LIDO, that's what people need. Yep. Most of us here, I have the capability myself to write something like that, but do I want to take the time to, natively strip the data out, figure out what the LIDO scheme is going to be, write the XML? I mean, please, no. Please, tool, give me at least something to start with. I then hand edit it as Rob described. I'll do that, but it has to be done for me. It can't be something I do myself.
So the good news is that there are actually tools. One of them is Kobo, which CogApp very kindly produced a couple of years back, that has now been modified to work with LIDO, which Emmanuelle says that they use. Yes. Then another is a tool called Mint, which Bill made reference to. Mint is it's a mapping tool. You can map anything to it, but it works with LIDO, so it doesn't have to be LIDO. If you just like to map one thing to another, you can use Mint. This was created out of a university in Greece for the Europeana project, and you can request access to it, and they will give it to you. You just have to request it, so you can look that up online. But the other good news is that through Europeana, there was a project called Europeana Inside, which it brought collection management vendors together to come up with a tool to allow you to export or map your stuff to LIDO. And most major collection management systems have just completed this project. So I highly encourage you to, if you want to know if your collection management vendor supports LIDO, to ask them the question. Because the last time I talked to them about this in September, I said, are you widely promoting it? And they said, no, most of our clients don't even know what LIDO is. But if they asked us about it, we happily would walk them through how they can have access to the tool and to use it. So, and in fact, I'm going to point out Norbert here, who represents Museums Plus, and their system actually exports into LIDO. So we have a vendor here right now who does it.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you do talk to your vendor and the answer is, well, no, not yet, then at least by having asked, you've now let your vendor know that this is something that would be useful to you.
And from my perspective, there are features that we're thinking about producing for the site that if an institution gives us LIDO, then they will be able to take advantage of those. If they do not provide LIDO, sorry, we don't know what your data really is saying. We don't have the confidence that what your fields are the same as everyone else's, so you can't participate in that particular feature.
Go ahead, Len.
This will be really quick, actually. I was just thinking, maybe taking that one step further, if CMS or whatever can produce it. Have you guys thought about going to the vendors and saying, how about we hook up our services so they can hit a button that says export to Google our project, and it just does the LIDO transfer automatically? That would really be simple, right? For a lot of people who post that to really do anything.
Talked about, I've certainly brought it up with a couple of the vendors. The issue's been, again, coming back to the cataloging standards. That even if I get the properly validated LIDO format out, that I'd still have to do more logic on top of it in terms of making sure that what they put in those fields is the same as what everybody else puts in those fields. So.
And I'd just like to point out also that I think at some point this modeling exercise needs to really reside with the institution rather than with the vendors. I mean, the data, the value of the data is owned by the museum. So in my eyes, at least, that's where that knowledge should reside.
Yeah, and I think the other upside to that is the extent to which it does live at the museum helps naturally to ensure that it doesn't then drift back towards some sort of, how to put it, getting the material out through different channels to different endpoints is still not just run it once and you're done and you can give it to whoever you want to give it to, because there could be dependencies that you don't even know exist.
Sure, Len.
Yeah. And I apologize in advance if this is a little digression or totally irrelevant. But I'm wondering about how these standards apply to object information that's becoming that's really quite emergent, such as architectural renderings, 3D simulations, and the frameworks. The very rapid emergence of STL and other type files that are becoming files distributed by museums. I mean, and those, to my knowledge, do have their own seemingly isolated metadata sets that probably, in terms of objects, overlap considerably. So I look forward to the day, whether it's Artstor or others, that these sort of files are as downloadable as an images today. Is there thought being given to that? Is that being emerged? Is there are we at a point where it may be more easy to coalesce consensus now as these objects grow, collections grow?
So
that's totally irrelevant.
No. I mean, if I understand it correctly, I mean, I would say that LIDO actually can accommodate it because you have the ability through the resources element to talk about any type of resource that supports the object. I mean, LIDO is really meant for describing the object, and then if you have a 3D rendering and there is lots of descriptive information that you want to associate about that 3D rendering that you want to then tie back to the object, you can, if that answers the question. And then there's no reason why you could not make that 3D model or rendering go with your object metadata.
And that was my impression, give or take a few fields that might be specific to that type of object and may fit within your framework, I don't know. But I also wonder whether it might be no longer be premature to promote LIDO to those who are producing these objects. I don't know, Museum or Art Institute of Chicago is thinking in terms of cataloging these type of objects within a LIDO framework, rather than waiting for that to get even more dispersed than it is now to allow some sort of early conversion. So that was my.
I think it's great. I think it's a great homework assignment, and I'll reach out to someone at the Reichs and ask them to try out LIDO and do an example for us. And if they do it, we'll post it on the site so that we can all check it out. So yeah, no, really serious. It's great.
Cool. Great, thanks, Lynn. Other questions? Comments? Ben,
on, Ben.
Have no fear. Ask as many as you have.
You won't tell, I just have to ask, Bill, Peter, are you publishing the inscriptions? Yale?
Oh, we will. I mean, that's why, right? That's the whole point. Once we have all this complex content, we will. That's why we are discovering the same problem. Because I'm so happy now. Well, I tell you now.
Do your internal system
exactly. Yes, we. Only one. I think we have two. I'm looking at that.
We don't care which one.
But
right,
then
it's arbitrary where it lives in that LIDO
But if
stage.
they switch, then I may have problem.
So you could simply merge in and say, well, we don't want to give them, I'm going to do my text.
Yeah.
And I go one step further and I look at the wrapper and then I look at the name of whatever field that they've given and I use that as the field name and I use the value as whatever it is, because I'm not going to get in that fight. I don't. Yeah, in terms of I know that they put it in the wrapper in a particular format and they have a way of describing it. I'll use that as the way that they want to talk about it, and every museum has their own.
You're happy with both of them as they are?
Yeah, totally. I'm agnostic. We're Switzerland over here, totally.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, thoughts, concerns? It's been a long conference. It's almost over. If anybody does want to ask any of us anything less publicly, we'll be around for a bit still.
I want to ask them too.
Peter,
I mean, in
please
terms
do.
of the questions, in terms of like what do you imagine is the problem for those of you who might have been considering LIDO? What is it that's keeping you from it? I mean, is it the tools that are missing? Is it just the fact that it looks like a big stack of XML that you just don't want to tackle, or what's the problem? Come on. Why aren't we generating more and more LIDO? Yeah.
I'm just at a data point. I just checked my email because I still get very occasionally license requests for Kobo, and someone I change the form to say I'm interested in doing this in CD driven, or LIDO, and if they say LIDO, I send them data plus L file as well. So I just check LIDO. I think I've sent it out to 13 people.
Okay.
And how many people got it directly from?
Yeah.
Two. I'm wondering what the other 11 are.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm just trying to figure this out in terms of whether it's the tools or whether it's
So for us, it's and this is in the Yale Art Gallery, so right across the street from the British Center, and we don't do LIDO simply because I mean I have to say we could do the mappings, would have to build our own tools because we're not going to use Coburn, but basically just write up velocity, in velocity to generate that XML. But to be honest, for us, it's more of a, when we're looking at allocating resources, where is the value going to come back to us at some point? And yet we contribute to Artstor, we're going to continue that, but
So it's a value proposition thing.
Allocating, looking at our time over the next year and saying, when are we going to carve out the time, one, to build it, and then two, to support it over time. And as our data gets necessarily more complex, basically just feeding that.
So if me and Bill come up with like the perfect way of like exposing art to the world, then and we tell you the only way we can manage that is if you give us LIDO, you imagine more people will look at that as a value proposition that's worth doing, or?
I think so, but I think that, it's again, whether exposing our art through the Google Art project internally, whether there's value to that, whether curators, administration, whether they see that mechanism as having value necessarily, because I think that's also an open question as to, do we want to expose our collections through those avenues? I think that no one objects to LIDO necessarily.
Yeah.
I think that there are certainly questions within the community about that, and so
and you already
allocate resources to
you already exposed CDWA Lite,
Yeah.
so you're already there. you are,
We do. I mean, we do have, and basically, I think we're looking at LIDO, but again, it's a matter of resource allocation internally, and then building, continuing that on through basically saying we're going to do this for the next 10 years, basically, and we're going to make a promise to support it. Because right now our contributions to cross collections discovery service are essentially broken because services deprecated and now it's just not working. So we, to make an investment, you got to be able to support it for years and years and years, and that's the question for us.
In the case of my institution, we're just beginning to do data transfers, so it's nice to sort of see something and say, okay, that's the direction to go with. Because we're about to give stuff to Artstor, we probably would be interested in, giving stuff to Google, beginning to work with other places where, knowing the way to do it, or at least knowing the preferred way to do it, gives us the ability to sort of walk in the door with something in hand.
Great. Any remaining comments, questions?
For us,
Kyle.
We have our data structured in a way that it probably wouldn't be very hard for us to do it. So there's nothing really stopping us, I guess, at this point from doing that, outside of probably spending a day or two to just map it out. So I guess probably the reason I would say that we haven't done it would be that the workflows that we have internally are not on the technology team, actually, in terms of getting the data to you guys. It actually happens through our rights team. And their workflows are pretty streamlined already, and so yes, we could probably help them and it would speed things up for them. So that's a reason to, I think, for us to look at it and to take their workload away from that. But at the same time, they're not complaining about it, so we haven't jumped in as another way. And honestly, I don't think I knew until today that both of you took this in. So
that's why we're here.
Yeah, and Kyle, let me ask if it doesn't put you on the spot. With the sense that IMA is doing very cool sort of delivery platform agnostic middleware stuff internally. Is that correct? You've got this API layer between backend systems and public facing stuff. With an architecture like that in place, it also makes me wonder whether if LIDO were to prove to be a good fit for transport format across that layer, then maybe it also turns out to be like 2 for the price of 1. If that makes sense. Use it internally and expose it out that way too. Not to look for an answer, but yeah.
More lightweight than just
Yeah.
JSON is typically what's used internally, just because it's smaller and we don't need that level of description internally.
Yeah.
But like I said, to expose that to you guys, it's not that much work, just because we already have the infrastructure in place. But I think it was, for us, it's always has been the value proposition, like they said.
Yeah.
And knowing that if there's 2 things that we can offload work from, 1 or 2 people in our institution, they're having to do it by hand now, that's probably a good enough case for us to go ahead and do it. But it's just, I guess, knowing that there's going to be people using it, so we know that there's more value to it, then we're just going to do it just to do it, because I don't want to spend time doing something regardless of what the scheme is. We did the 2RML spec, but if there's no reason to use that one, why do we use that either?
Yep.
Same kind of thing. So yeah, that's my take on it, I guess.
Yeah. So straw poll on a hypothetical question. If LIDO could be kind consistently expressed in JSON instead of native XML, would that be more useful to anybody here? Or would it not make a whole bunch of difference? Yeah. Couple, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, lighter weight in certain ways. But, yeah.
To consume, produce.
Yeah. This is what I was, yeah.
This is news to me
Right.
today, which is great, I'm glad I'm here. B, what about Artstor, Art Resource, and DPLA, and all these
Yeah.
other places that want our data?
Well,
every time I have to devote a team, a week or a month to get the data in the shape that they want.
Yeah, and for, yeah. And Douglas, yeah. Absolutely. And that's a big part of that. That is the value proposition, for me at least, is at this point we are interested, not that we're operating on the scale you guys are, but for the things we do have that people are interested in. Anybody who can take in effectively the same LIDO file or a structurally identical LIDO file with some different content in it that we're kicking out to Bill and to Peter, have at it, man. But if it requires some sort of one-off, bespoke, tweaky stuff, and it has to be structured differently, and it's going to suck up a few days here and there on its own, it's not so likely we're going to have the bandwidth to do that. And this, make it once, share it to whoever wants it, as long as that fits appropriately with whatever policies and strategies you have that are driven content side, then it's far more efficient, at least for people at the supply end. But, Norbert.
Since we are going there, so we work with a lot of museums, helping them to produce LIDO for a lot of different aggregators. So that's already a good thing that all the different aggregators take LIDO on. But please, aggregators, talk to each other to interpret LIDO the same way, because we don't. You have different mandatory fields, you interpret the content differently, so in the end it sounds perfect and that it should be like that. But the fact is that one museum with one collection management system, one LIDO export tool has to do like 3 different LIDO exports and mappings for 3 different aggregators, and that's not nice.
Yeah, well, and those museums are nicer than we are, because what we end up saying is, we've got this thing, Peter can deal with it, Bill can deal with it. If you can deal with this same thing, great. If not, really sorry, we wish we could, which is not as nice, but maybe practical in certain ways. Yeah, it is. It is. That's the business case and the value proposition in our shop is if we can give you the same thing we already gave these other guys, then beautiful. Yes.
Planning on revising CCR so that you can put LIDO into that content standard somehow, the same way that DAX does with maybe to kind of illustrate how the content standard fits with the data structure.
It's such a good question. No, but we've often talked about it, and I think it's just the real question is whether there has been talk about bringing together CCO, the catalog and cultural objects, with LIDO, so that as you're using LIDO, you're getting specific recommendations for how to actually do the cataloging within the elements that specifically comes from catalog and cultural objects. So you marry the two together. We had actually talked about doing that in the beginning with the specification online, that there would actually be instructions with each element that was directly lifted from CCO. And honestly, it was just a matter of work. I mean, it's just a lot of work. But no, I completely agree. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Because there isn't that illustrative model.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. And it's good to hear you say it, because it just means that I will just raise it up again as something that we should seriously consider. So.
We mapped LIDO to our content, internal content standards, the best that we could.
That's great.
Just to illustrate that, conceptually,
Yeah, that's fantastic.
As a museum standard-wide practice, I think it's crucial.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I
would
agree. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Evan.
No, I was about to make the same point in a slightly different way. That RDA, AACR2, MARC, EAD, archival descriptive standards have all been sent down from the American or international standards committees. So if we could just as the American Institute or whatever, say that okay, well this is the standard. I mean that would then allow us local practitioners to make that demand on our administrators and say, well, to be in compliance, compliance says a lot. That we need to do this. And right now, everyone's so happy with idiosyncratic data, idiosyncratic systems of delivery, that it's hard to make that argument if it doesn't have a direct business value outcome.
Yes.
Scott.
I kind of want to disagree with that, or at least frame it in a slightly different perspective. Because from the library archive perspective, this is part of their existing body of knowledge. This is what they learn in school. And I don't think that this discussion is necessarily a part of the educational process, as far as I'm aware of, in museum studies programs, or at least if it is, how much of a role is it really? How many people coming out of these programs are taught LIDO, are taught CCO, are taught these standards? You talk to someone coming out of an ILS program, they can tell you all of these things cited like that. Where is that in our educational process aside from we're simply interested in it? I think that's a huge problem.
It is. I mean, I should say that from the programs that I know, it is being taught. So I know that from the Library and Information Science program at UCLA has been teaching LIDO for the last 4 years now. I know that Johns Hopkins is building it into their digital curation program. So but it's been recent. So, and LIDO is fairly recent as well. But it is being incorporated now into more programs that actually impact museums.
And I think that will be, I think what'll be, maybe 10 years or 5 years before you truly see it permeate. But for the archival community, it's been 40 years, and I think that's,
this is absolutely true.
So I think it's good that it's starting now, but we're not going to be able to, in 5 years, 10 years, we'll probably see a much more dramatic impact of that educational process.
Yeah.
I don't think that can be understated in terms of comparing museums to libraries and archives.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
There is no switch to flip for this.
Yeah, that's always been the case, that sort of discrepancy between museums and libraries and archives in their adoption of standards.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Anyone else? Going once, going twice? Ben.
I know.
A very modest proposal. If there was someone here who knew someone who worked at a little startup in Mountain View, was able to say, that schema level stuff, that's fine, that goes somewhere nice, but if you embedded LIDO in the head of your collection web pages, a search engine that I know is going to use that in some interesting way. Will that provide a little more pull and business space?
I mean, you can express LIDO in schema.org, and I don't think we'll do anything beyond schema.org, but IMA's pages already do it. But there's no reason why we couldn't extend schema.org museum object schema to be LIDO compliant.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about really the lack of pull.
Right.
Yes.
There's not enough reason.
Yeah.
And we'll go and talk to big. Those guys seem to do
All right. Well, on that note, thank you all for being here. As